And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already tonight. Of course, I am joined tonight by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia's special reports tonight, Ghislaine Maxwell. The sentencing all worked out rather interestingly. Let's say 20 years is what she got. And this case has not been covered properly in the mainstream media, of course. They've kept all the real names out, and they've also kept the special purposes for this trial out, and they've just kind of floated on the surface of, oh, she's Epstein's bad co-pilot. So we're going to get into the real hardcore piece tonight on this. We're going to do about 90 minutes in the special report on Ghislaine Maxwell and really show those deep interconnecting ties with Ghislaine, not only in relation to the deep state, which I think is pretty well covered in the alternative media generally and really left out on the mainstream side, but the thing that nobody really gets into is the big key with the Atlantis part. And that what we've really brought to the table and shown those connections. Now, we've done 3 episodes, hot zone episodes, that relate to Ghislaine, 2 directly and 1 indirectly, which was the Colonel in the hot zone, all about Colonel Sanders' daughter and her very interesting connections. That comes up again tonight as well. And we're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program tonight. So Miss Olivia will be putting those together. I have a lot to jump into on this, and we're going to have a lot of fun getting into this tonight because there's a lot of things that have been left on the table and that have kind of arisen as a result of this case, including many of the depositions, which are going to be very telling and really let us know on a deeper level what this case is actually all about, which is really what we're here for. This is the Dark Journalist Special Report. Ghislaine Maxwell. This is all about her sentencing and also the deeper aspects of the Atlantis mystery. That background there, very thick in the hot zone and very thick through her project, TerraMar, this nonprofit which she raised herself during her sentencing, saying that, hey, we were trying to save the oceans through TerraMar and the Clinton Global Initiative, putting herself right in the middle of that Clinton deep state so as not to let them forget, hey, I'm out here. Remember me? I was at Chelsea's wedding. After all, let's not forget. Before we jump into questions, Miss Olivia.
This is a great question right away. Kalanu Arte says, do you think the Belial group were into pedophilia?
Well, I mean, the Belial part has to be understood through the lens of what the mystery schools have given us about it. So the Casey aspect. So we're going to get to understand their mentality. But you're going to find a lot of strange things relating to the Belial group. Some of it goes back to Egyptian mysticism. And there's a kind of an incest thread that runs through that dark side of that mysticism. And then, so as we develop that, you know, the perversions of things come quite naturally in the Belial side. And if you really go hardcore on the Casey readings in relation to Belial, and again, the way that he said it in the readings was Belial. And later, people who've interpreted it have tried to say, is that Baal in the Bible, Baal, which has the same type of pronunciation? That could very well be that this is what they're talking about. That was the next kind of wave of it. This is the whole Belial harmonic piece that shows up in the mystery schools, and it's not so well understood. I think that the Belial-Emilius battle, which took place in Atlantis, according to the mystery schools, when you look at the Casey readings on it, what he's talking about is a group that's dedicated to using the technology for spiritual purposes versus a group that is dedicated to using the really advanced technology for domination, but domination through mental sourcing. That is, they use the crystals and the 2-eye crystals and the technology with their minds. And this is where the Atlanteans ended up. And this is where we're heading now. If you really read a lot of the transhumanism aspects, they're talking about, Michio Kaku recently came out and said, well, you know, your car is going to be thinking and it's going to be reading your mind where you want to go and things like that. So I guess you better be thinking straight. But he's talking about all about the mind reading technology. This is where we have to kind of orient ourselves on this, which is they're already 50, 100 years ahead of us on that side. And many of them are deep in the Belial piece. Just look at all the advanced scientists who were around Epstein. This is a group that believes in a kind of super being incarnation through the technology. And the cult itself, coming out of Atlantis, they had achieved a great deal. In fact, they had won. They had defeated the Emilius group. The only problem is they destroyed the world in the process. And so we're looking at, some of the phrases from the Casey readings, the echoes of that, right is might, the terrible crystal, these types of things. And this is woven right into the middle of the Ghislaine story. This is something that we've put together here by watching their connections and by finding those threads that are very real. So there's very little actually that's speculative tonight. It all can be shown and sourced, which we will. And I would say that we've laid out a picture in some of the episodes that we've done dealing with Colonel Sanders' daughter and with Ghislaine, but there's a thread there, which I think we can connect up using the sentencing as a kind of springboard by taking a look at some of those depositions that got this situation going in the first place. And Virginia Giuffre, that was a very important one because it identified two figures that are crucial to understanding the Atlantis Belial link to Epstein and Maxwell. And those two figures are Marvin Minsky, was the father of AI, and he was over here at MIT for many, many years, and spewing very, very heavy-duty transhumanist language. And that whole thing about, the hand in the Terminator that they find, and they later kind of reanimate this whole Terminator based on that. That's all kind of a ripoff of Minsky. This is what Minsky was after. He wanted that human-machine interface, and he sort of looked down on humanity. He considered humanity meat robots. That's the way he described them. And he didn't believe in any deity. And he was obsessed with our minds and what our minds can do. So there's a real kind of Belial type figure and a genius as well. And he had all sorts of interesting things in his background, as do many of the scientists who come into the picture tonight. The inventor of the laser is going to show up this evening as well. Minsky is a very interesting jumping off point because he's a key that Giuffre gave us in her deposition, saying that, part of this ring that had been set up by Maxwell and Epstein wanted her basically to perform sexual favors for Minsky. But interestingly enough, as they were trying to do this, probably to blackmail Minsky and then therefore gain more knowledge, he didn't show up. He skipped out on the whole thing. So it gets very, very interesting, the connections there with Minsky. Before we get into all that, let's grab the kind of official version of events here about the trial and its sentencing. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special report on Ghislaine Maxwell and her sentencing, and the key and the strangeness, the Atlantis key about Ghislaine Maxwell, which you're going to find out is very real through her very interesting nonprofit TerraMar, which was supposedly about preserving the oceans, but which I can show was really about investigating ancient ruins in the hot zone, which is a crucial piece of all this. And we'll do our best to explain it tonight. We're going to do, like I said, about an hour and a half with this, and we'll save the last half hour for your questions. How's that?
Doing great.
All right. Vanity Fair today. By the time Ghislaine Maxwell, dressed in blue prison garb and shackles, walked into a Manhattan courtroom on Tuesday morning, her descent from the heights of society and wealth had been well in the making. And so on and so forth. Oh, the fallen, socialite, British socialite. They won't call her, a madam or a pimp, which is really what the deal is. No pictures in the courtroom, just this drawing stuff of her receiving her sentencing there and her statement and all the rest. In late December, after a 3-week trial, federal jury found Maxwell guilty on 5 charges of aiding Epstein's abuse. It's definitely a deep relationship there she had with Epstein going all the way back to the 80s. And as we're going to find out tonight, Epstein, real major deep state player, absolutely obsessed on this Atlantis side as well. So they made a really good pair. Epstein's 2019 death in federal custody while awaiting trial, which authorities ruled a suicide, even they don't believe it, prompted a heightened outcry over the financier's long trail of crimes. I can't imagine a more high-profile prisoner, with the exception of Julian Assange. Epstein should have been guarded round the clock, and they're like, oh, the camera's broke, so we can't show his suicide and all the rest. So they removed Epstein. There's some rumors that he still survived and everything else. It seems to me he was too much of a heightened risk and that they just got rid of him, period. But in any case, he had to be eliminated off the board pretty quickly. And I think that the Epstein level of blackmail and the deep state involvement, but also this other piece, the eugenics Atlantis Belial piece, all that couldn't be allowed to come out in one big rush. And it would have, through Epstein, just from people who were already starting to get unusual signals from his background and the things that he was doing over here at Harvard, funding eugenics research. All right, let's keep going. Maxwell took the podium shortly after. Her statement constituted her most extensive public comments in years. It is hard for me to address the court after listening to the pain and anguish expressed in the statements today, she said in a mostly steady voice. And she went on to kind of say, I'm a victim too, which really no one was buying. Maxwell said in her 2 years of solitary confinement since her arrest, she had ample opportunity to reflect on her relationship with Epstein and his profoundly compartmentalized life. There's a lot of very interesting commentary and steganography that Epstein lays out there, including the fact that she made up this mythical character while she was in jail who was like a poltergeist that was doing things, like moving things around and flushing toilets and things like that. And so it's like her imaginary friend there. There's a lot of unusual steganography she used around it in the names that she gave to it. But let's keep going. Jeffrey Epstein should have been here before all of you, Maxwell said. She noted the year 2005, 2009, and 2019. Also steganography. I'll get into that. All the many times he was accused, charged, and prosecuted. But while Maxwell conceded that today is not about Epstein, ultimately, she left her apology to victims. I'm sorry for the pain you've experienced. And the story went off the front page. And it came off the front page very fast. They did not want to deal with this. They don't want to deal with the Maxwell story at all because it implicates so many people and has been pointed out by pretty much everyone who has any idea what journalism is. To say that this woman should be prosecuted for the crime of human trafficking and then not to say who she did the human trafficking to is absurd. It's like saying she should go to jail for stealing all that money and not mentioning who she stole it from. So we have to get our heads kind of wrapped around how they're handling this and how they've really kept it under wraps. Even a 3-week trial is pretty fast. Think of all the coverage that the Johnny Depp trial changed, just completely pushed out there as a huge propaganda machine. And how does that change anything if you think about it? So we learn Amber Heard did all these awful things and that, Johnny Depp was a creep too. That doesn't change anything about the culture. That's just hype. But this trial, which we could learn something about that ruling political process, was kept really heavily in the dark. And with the fast elimination of Epstein, we can really see why. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Special Report. We're going to go deep here tonight. Ghislaine Maxwell and her sentencing and her connection to this unusual Belial cult, which we've described before, and I'm going to kind of connect those dots even tighter tonight with some other names as well. And if you've seen that episode, Colonel in the Hot Zone or Ghislaine in the Hot Zone, those really are the setup for the special report and her sentencing. Just the perfect timing for us to get this out. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter that keeps us in touch through the remarkable censorship that we've been seeing just off the charts in social media, dealing with many, many issues. You touch on a certain issue and you get shadow banned and all the rest of it. But unfortunately, there's too many people who do this who, are just going to spend all this time complaining. And I don't blame them for all the censorship. I don't think it helps ultimately. So we've been pretty good about rolling forward through it in any case. But ultimately, the best idea would be to be on that free newsletter list. That gets you access to all the shows that are coming up and gives you the intel about the things that we're going to be doing this summer. Some remarkable interviews coming up for you with some great X-series shows, along with some very exciting events coming up this summer and fall. So keep close with that. And basically, you go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for that newsletter, and that's just the way you hear about everything. And then if you want to go a deeper level, go ahead and subscribe to the site and support the efforts that we're doing on this program. Okay, Miss Olivia, before I jump in, go for it.
Buis Lale says, DJ, have you heard of the breeding program Epstein was running at Zoro Ranch he owned in New Mexico? Large underground rooms reported.
Oh, this is very, yeah. Well, there's all kinds of Atlantis imagery there as well. But this thing about Zoro Ranch is interesting because, I've been tracking something totally different that I've been referring to as the Lilith cult coming directly through Hollywood. And Sue Lyon and a lot of the things around Lolita and George Hodel and this whole kind of wing of things, John Huston, cut in really tightly with that. But what's fascinating for me is that if you go into that movie Lolita, there's somebody there through the Peter Sellers character who is, into all this really kind of dark occult stuff and all this weird sexual stuff, and after Lolita. And it's pretty interesting because when she describes at the end of the story to the James Mason character what happened with that, she says, well, this guy, the Peter Sellers character, whisked her away to a ranch in New Mexico. You're going to find a few interesting tie-overs for things like that. So this may be almost something that's handed down and passed down. And I want to suggest that with Epstein's role. There's a guy named Bobby Baker who was the secretary of the Senate during LBJ's, when LBJ was the Senate Majority Leader and later president. He went down hard for running a call girl ring and doing all this blackmail directly out of the Senate and Congress. And he was one of the reasons why LBJ was on his way out by the time Kennedy's limo had taken that turn onto Elm Street and Dealey Plaza. There was a Senate committee that was meeting and deciding what charges to lay against Johnson. But Bobby Baker and the Bobby Baker scandal was part of that. And Baker ended up going to prison. And LBJ's other partner, Billy Celestes, was also going to prison for another LBJ-related thing. So the sexual blackmail piece was a big way that the intelligence agencies were running the show. If you go into that era, the Profumo affair in the UK, taking down the whole government using this high-price call girl ring, that was part of it as well. So we see that this is something that's institutionalized and handed down, which is why we're going to take a look tonight at the father of the former Attorney General William Barr, who was a big Bushite. But we also know that he was the one who got Epstein started, and Epstein didn't even have a degree. He was a real flunky, and they threw him into a teaching position at this kind of elite prep school. And this was odd too, because he didn't have the wherewithal to teach math and physics at all. So he's being promoted there. The question is, why? Later, he'll move in those Rockefeller circles and get set up in investment banking and all the rest. And then he's off to the races. But who is positioning him? Who's moving him on that board? And one of the reasons I suggest that we are always paying attention to a lot of the deep state researchers is they study how the intelligence agencies operate, Professor Peter Dale Scott and people of this ilk. And when they see people moved around on the board, it's like the classic cases of Lee Harvey Oswald, for example, who's moving him into Russia and then getting him back and putting money in his bank account and things like that. These are the intelligence agencies putting their patsies into place, putting their designated culprits into place, and ultimately, putting their blackmailers into place as well. So we need to understand how that dynamic operates. And you're going to find out that, in fact, Barr, former Attorney General Barr, was a big figure working with Bush in the 70s to block the release and to destroy the JFK assassination records that the CIA held. So there's a real legacy here when we get into these things. So we have a deep state aspect, but here's the other part. We have a huge occultist aspect with this. And it's not just people, standing around in robes and wanting to do human sacrifice. It's deeper. It's a lot deeper than that. It's a whole insight on how they think and how they think they're going to take over, and who they think they're summoning to lead them to do it. And also, what is actually the interdimensional aspect of this, and how are they attempting to conjure it? So we need some knowledge of those things to really understand. Otherwise, you're just left with the story of, pedophile island, Lolita Island, and all of these things, which I understand how that aspect works, but it is sensationalism at a certain point. If you don't go deeper, it's just people saying, oh, it's a satanic pedo on an island and whatever, right? But it's actually, if you look at it as a group that is dedicated around a process, then and understanding that there's an Atlantis relation to it. So then we start to understand what they think their origin story is all about, and how deep on the mystery school side is this. Remember, Rudolf Steiner from Anthroposophy said the entire American political system in 1920 was right-hand occult mystery school groups and left-hand occult mystery groups, and that they all understood and recognized each other, and that they opposed each other in many factions. So that piece is there, and it's probably high time we understand it, because what's been going on in the political process, and the Epstein case and Ghislaine Maxwell case are perfect representations of this. We're kind of out to lunch, because we're like, what just took place? What happened? And what you see on the surface, and then people are getting bumped off. This is like, Jack Ruby, who supposedly is a pimp, getting in to eliminate the most high-profile prisoner, Lee Harvey Oswald. It doesn't happen. There's a famous quote from Fidel Castro when he's watching it. He's like, I know something about security. That would never happen. So, we have to understand the staged world versus what is actually taking place. And through the lens of the trial of Maxwell, some of the things that came out, luckily, I was looking for these things, and we definitely got lucky. We're going to be able to understand it. I'm going to get into that right now before I jump, Miss Olivia.
So a lot of people want to minimize Ghislaine and Epstein as sexual blackmail, right, of political elites and whatnot. What makes you, if you had to do an elevator pitch, and say, nope, it's much more esoteric than that, much more occult than that, what would you say?
Yeah, there's no way you could do it in an elevator pitch, but I like what you're saying. No, fundamentally, let's use the pseudonym that Ghislaine used when she rented a house in New Hampshire, not far, and she was hiding out. What was the name that she chose, as we highlighted? Janet Atlantis. Okay, Janet Atlantis Marshall was an author and an activist. And it's a very interesting thing. I actually, I think it's crucial in this case to understand how all that plays out. So I have that piece right here. Maxwell posed as journalist Janet Marshall to buy luxury hideout. So Janet Atlantis Marshall, this author, who was an activist, who was out of Portland, Oregon, and very powerful on the feminism side, is obviously some connection here with Ghislaine, because she's using this name as a pseudonym, not just in purchasing property, but all around. If you go and you hunt down the background on Janet Atlantis Marshall, you're going to find she's the author of 5 very interesting books. But you're going to find that her mother's name is Atlantis Octavia. I'll show a few of these here. So we got some orientations around the name. Atlantis Octavia. Atlantis 8. So Octavia is 8, the 8th continent. Janet Atlantis Marshall. That is the person that we're talking about. This is the name Ghislaine is operating under. So, first of all, why does she have this name, the actual Janet Atlantis Marshall, and why does her mother have the name? Then, the next thing is, hold on, why is she using it? So this is an instant dot connection piece in full public view. The next piece is that her husband, Scott Bergeron, who's working for Cargometrics here in Boston, which again is a sea lane company that's obsessed with Antarctica. And it's about, it's not, they don't actually do anything. What they do is they bet on who is going to show up first on the sea lanes. Cargometrics doesn't actually even make anything. It's a strange investment company. It guesses.
That is a really weird idea.
Indeed. Well, what's funny is Cargometrics, there's a very interesting interview where he's talking and he's giving his diatribe about what the company does. And he says, I think we can find great things in the Arctic. This is another big push of theirs. And he says, you know, just imagine the island of Atlantis raising out of the ocean, full treasures intact. Just think about the kind of subconscious mind that somebody has to use that as a reference. So they're obviously familiar with Atlantis and the idea of it rising in treasure and all the rest. So that's her husband. Then we have Janet Atlantis Marshall. So instantly you're in that milieu. Then if you go to Epstein and Zoro Ranch, there's all kinds of Atlantis iconography, Mercury, and all the rest. The same thing on Epstein Island. So we've got the Atlantis overhang immediately when you're dealing with these people. The next thing is, what do they believe about Atlantis? And that's where Marvin Minsky and the transhumanist connection with these people comes through. We didn't have that connection until Virginia Giuffre's deposition. So that is an open door now. What does that connect us into? Well, one of the things that we've pointed out is that one of the main connections that we have with Marvin Minsky is to Margaret Adams, or Margaret Adams Sanders, Colonel Sanders' daughter. And she, the great quest of her life was to find ruins of Atlantis in the hot zone. And she spent many, many years being around when they found the Bimini Wall. The group that she had created, Mars, M-A-R-S, they were the ones who discovered the Bimini Wall. Valentine was associated with that whole thing, along with her son, Trig Adams, who we've spoken to. Now, I've spoken to some people in her circle who were very informative and very, very interesting. But then when it came time to really kind of go a level deeper, how can I say this? They suffered a kind of cowardly lion aspect. Is that a good way to put it? Mm-hmm. So they felt like, you know, oh, they had opened up about this thing and they shouldn't have. The point is, although their mom was secretive about the Atlantis part and wanted to keep it and what they discovered secret, it's many, many years later. And that stuff just hanging out there without the public knowing about it is not a good idea. So it's actually much more important and serves the legacy, I would say, of Margaret Adams. But let's take a quick look at her obit, and we're going to find some interesting things right away. Remember, now, Colonel Sanders' daughter, Margaret Sanders, remember, there's the colonel, of course, of KFC. Nobody can miss him. Just a phenomenal legend of a guy, and interesting story there as well. But her thing really is to give us that inkling, that insight of what was going on there with the whole Atlantis piece in the Bahamas. Here's how she describes things in her own background. Okay, so she's friends with Einstein. Okay, that's established. They have letters between. So why is Einstein talking to this woman? She does a bust of Winston Churchill that he comes and sits for. Why is Winston Churchill dealing with her? She and the colonel will go to the White House and for the inaugural of President Nixon, and before that as well. So yes, the colonel is a figure that people are familiar with, but he wasn't as ubiquitous then as he became. So something is already working in the background around her. In the obit, Ms. Sanders also had a big interest in the lost continent of Atlantis and flew to Miami and Bimini in search of it. Now, she lived in the hot zone for many years, and she would actually claim that she found the lost city of Atlantis there in the hot zone. So she, it is learned later by the scientists who are trying to get in with Minsky and trying to spend time with him. They're like, there's no way to really get this guy and pin him down and get him to dinner or whatever. But then one of them learns, oh, I have a really good friend who is best friends with him and his wife, and that is Margaret Adams. And they talk that whole connection. And they say the person who is Minsky's best friend is Margaret. So Minsky is best friends with the colonel's daughter, and she's friends with Einstein. So now let's start to get around Margaret Adams Sanders and start to figure out what is going on here with her research in Atlantis. We have to, if we're going to understand that, we're going to have to go into the work of Edgar Cayce and what he said about that place there in the hot zone. And we've done it through many episodes here trying to describe what's operational there. And I recommend those hot zone episodes if you haven't seen them. But I'm going to do this briefly just to get us oriented. And this is the episode I recommend on that. It is an episode about Alexandra Cousteau and Ghislaine Maxwell called The Craze in the Hot Zone. All right. This is really going to change things if we get it right. Okay, let's start with this. So Edgar Cayce gives over 14,000 readings between 1909 and 1945. He had psychic activity before that, but they're only recorded in that period. But, he's dishing this out over 40 years. There's affidavits. There's people he healed by diagnosing them at a distance. There are predictions. There's a whole range of psychic activity that's kept there at the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach. But in there are 900 readings dealing with Atlantis. That's a lot. And there's a lot of information that Cayce gave in relation to this. I'm going to focus on one piece here, which is the Two-Eye Stone. This became an obsession, in my opinion, for the Belial group to find. And the Two-Eye Stone is now Tuaoi. And in those readings, he describes it basically as the hub of the entire culture of Atlantis before it goes down. And they're every bit as advanced as we are. Here's now, again, the connection. Remember Prince Andrew with Virginia Giuffre and our friend Maxwell hanging out there in the back. She put that whole thing together. It is through Giuffre that we get the Marvin Minsky reference. So Minsky leads us directly to the colonel's daughter, Margaret Adams, because they're best friends. And she's in search of Atlantis, and Minsky wants to be the ultimate transhumanist super Belial, man-machine merged thing. But in the middle of all that, they're seeking out this Two-Eye Stone, which is this power crystal that the Atlanteans use to power the entire culture. Now, when Cayce goes into a lot of the work around the Cayce Foundation is kind of, I don't want to say embarrassed by this, but they don't know how to deal with it, I think. And they do a really good job with other things, I think, generally. But they kind of drop the ball on Atlantis because they're afraid of it, let's say. They do a better job just saying, hey, it's holistic health and all the rest. But I think what we have here is a reluctance on the part of them to really promote those readings. So they just kind of hang out there in this netherworld, although his son thought it was a crucial issue and wrote the book Edgar Cayce in Atlantis all the way back in 1968, which sets off a firestorm among certain groups and creates this whole Atlantis wave. And you get the Cousteau, seeking Atlantis specials, and you get Atlantis rising. And it gets on the radar, it gets on the map. And that's a direct move from the mystery schools out into the public. But what happens is that gets cut at certain points, and that the serious research around it gets cut, and you don't hear anything about Atlantis rising. Instead, you get like Disney movies about the undersea kingdom, things of this nature. And that's the way they'd like to keep it, completely out of sight, out of mind. But Casey's story is very, very different, that we've entered an age where Atlantis is in fact rising, and the piece of it that's rising is right there off Bimini, through the Poseidon temple, which he says is rising off of Bimini. Now, all of that keep in the back of your mind as we move forward to what we're saying about the Two-Eye Stone. So the Two-Eye Stone then becomes a kind of obsession for these people, because if it powered that Atlantis culture and the Belial group sort of reigned supreme, they want it for those reasons. One of the things that Casey had said about the Two-Eye Stone was that it had just the opposite effect for the Amelius group. They didn't use it for physical domination technology at all. In fact, what they did is they groomed priestesses to use it from an early age and to develop the ability to contact the saint realm and bring those messages back directly. So you get all of that piece there directly from the hot zone readings, what I refer to as the hot zone. And those readings dealing with Bimini, the Bahamas, and a lot of the research around the lost city off of Cuba, et cetera, gives us that backdrop of what is actually happening there, that there's a number of groups and intelligence agencies looking at that material specifically to find out the secret to the Two-Eye Stone and to actually locate it physically in its bizarre upside-down world state that it became. Because Casey's story, when he's dealing with Atlantis, is very specific. What he's talking about is that at a certain point, you get these technologies are set, the levels are set too high. They cause destruction. They set off destructions when they're used for warlike purposes. So it's like a gigantic EMP, and we see this kind of massive devastation of the Atlantean culture. And what's left over is, takes off to Egypt, takes off to the Mayan culture, takes off to the Incan culture. And in the main, Atlantis sinks as a result of all this, and also some natural geographic tendencies as well. So that is the story of the Two-Eye Stone. Now we start to go back to Minsky and Margaret Adams to start to figure out what's going on here. All right. A quick thing about Margaret Adams from her own book, The Colonel's Secret. And you think that you're dealing here with basically, the story of a cookbook or the rise of a cooking legend. There's all kinds of very unusual things in here. One of the most unusual things is in the back of the book, there's something that says Noah Dietrich, who, by the way, is man number 2 in the Howard Hughes organization. And we know from the work that we've done on Howard Hughes, the big, powerful impact of the technology and the things that they were seeking. Noah Dietrich and Father sharing about the better things in life. That's Colonel Sanders and Noah Dietrich. Close like that. Again, very, very unusual connections. Noah Dietrich and Dr. Theodore Myman, the inventor of the laser beam, who is currently sitting for the bust I was sculpting for him. This guy invented the laser beam, which is fundamentally the modern day Two-Eye Stone. And those pictures, I'll just show them directly from the book. But that's the basic idea that you get there. And that's right in her own biography, The Colonel's Secret, by Margaret Sanders. So what we're getting at when we look at that is the figures involved, again, the highest possible scientific caliber, looking directly for Atlantis information. And then the developer of the laser, which Casey had described 40 years previously. This is going to be developed in 58, 59. And that's exactly, it shows up right on time. So these things are coming into place. And when they would ask Casey doing these readings in the 20s and 30s, what is the nature of this technology? And he would say, well, by this era of 1958, they're going to discover the laser and the maser. It'll be there. And that's when that stuff shows up. So we know that we're talking about the same technology. And obviously somebody else does too, because we've got the top MIT specialists, we've got deep state actors, we've got the colonel. So you have representations of all these different tiers of society, and they're all interested in this one piece, which is advanced technology and an ancient culture. Sometimes they're completely and directly interwoven with deep state operators, and that's where the Epstein Maxwell piece is going to serve us well. Everyone, you're watching this special report, our journalist special report on Ghislaine Maxwell, and the mystery, the Atlantis mystery that still hovers over this individual and her notorious cohort, Jeffrey Epstein. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program here in about 20 minutes. And we're just going to do a tight special report here. Maybe we'll go another half hour or so. And before I jump into the next section, Miss Olivia.
So Deborah Blair, could it be that one reason Epstein Maxwell blackmail of elite politicians, corporate management would both blackmail to fund research and then control the Atlantis findings? And Daniel Lazarus says, so you had to sleep with an underage girl before you could ride the submarine and see ruins so you wouldn't talk? Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways to engage in sexual blackmail. That is for sure. And Epstein was a master at it, but where did he get it from? Well, who appointed Epstein in the beginning? And that's the section I'm going to go into next, which is all about Donald Barr, which is Attorney General Barr's dad. And this does get us into that. Deborah's question is interesting, though, because at what point, what is the hierarchy for controlling the way that this rolls out? We have to go to Egerton Sykes, I think, to understand this part. So Egerton Sykes is a retired intelligence officer, British intelligence, and sterling record, and puts together the most complete library on Atlantis findings, and becomes an editor of things like the reprints of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly, etc., all the classics. And he's working, and he calls out the top scientists, and he puts together the Atlantis Journal, and he publishes all these copies. I was lucky enough to get my hands, after looking for this stuff for like 2 years, on every digital copy that was made of that journal, which I have. And Sykes, fundamentally, to sum it up, he basically feels that the first thing he wants to bring into our awareness is all the intelligence groups know about the hidden cities off of Cuba and in the hot zone. They're all aware of it. And that hot zone is basically a large-scale geopolitical war zone where groups like China and Russia and Cuba play off against each other. And, there's a number of things that happen in the hot zone, drug running, resource hunting, oil, all the rest of it. But this fundamental piece, nobody ever talks about. We never hear about this, that there's major, major ruins there in the hot zone. This is what Casey is getting at in his work. And we've talked about the people who were associated around this. And that range goes from JFK to Hemingway. There's a large scale awareness about this. And what I've found very interesting is when you get into that research around the hot zone, the key word is Spanish galleons. That's it. Because just like steganography, there's something on the surface where, of course, people look for Spanish galleons. There's all kinds of treasure involved and all the rest. So, but if I'm looking for ancient ruins related to this very secret venture around a lost continent, then I need a phrase. I need something. So when Castro calls in, for example, Paulina Zalitsky, he doesn't say, I'm looking for underwater ruins publicly. He says, well, he hired this company for what? What is written on the charter for that? He wrote down Spanish galleons. That's what you're going to find. So anyone, on that level who's looking for this stuff, all they have to do is say, I'm looking for Spanish galleons, and there you go. And all the NDAs that are signed around the hot zone and the ruins that people find there because I found a series of different types of people who dealt in the ocean saying, oh, I can't talk about it in that area in the hot zone, because if I'm in the military, I get court-martialed. If I work for a company, then I'm out of a job and I'm in violation. I'm in legal violation. So if they go down there and they see like a Temple of Isis underwater or something, they can't talk about it. And, they're mapping the ocean floor or looking for Spanish galleons, whatever it happens to be. So there's, according to Egerton Sykes, there's a huge game that's going on there. Now, what's interesting is there's a granddaughter of Sykes who was in the fashion industry, who was an intermediary and played on the same turf as Ghislaine. And I've tried to get more information on that as well. But the idea of how Epstein and Maxwell palled around with Jacques Cousteau's granddaughter, for example, who also is running an ocean nonprofit, this was very interesting. And I'm going to take us back now to Virginia Giuffre and the things that she said about Prince Andrew. Well, one of the people, and why I think her testimony is so compelling in the Giuffre testimony against Epstein, is, and I have a little bit of that I'm going to read, but one of the things that she brought forward, which is absolutely compelling, is she said, well, one of the people they really targeted is Alexandra Cousteau, and they wanted to get her involved in these kind of extracurricular sexual activities. For some reason, even though it seemed cast against type, it didn't seem like the thing that she was interested in. This wasn't like Bill Clinton or something. And also, she's not a very high profile figure. So why would they want that kind of blackmail on her? Why would they want her in this Belial cult? And one of the very interesting things, if you go back and look at it, is that Cousteau himself was said to, in his own investigations of the undersea world, Jacques Cousteau, and we have 50 years of research underwater from Jacques Cousteau, including an Atlantis series that's 4 hours long. But a lot of the things that were said, that he kept his own secrets about what he saw, because he didn't want other explorers to do it. So they were after, again, this information. How do you get this information? Well, if I'm on to Minsky and I want to pull him into my orbit, and I'm setting him up with Virginia Giuffre, and they're also trying to involve Alexandra Cousteau in these things, it seems like they're trying to either offer them an entree into this world, you share your secrets with me and you get entree to all this stuff, or I'm going to blackmail you into it. This is the blackmail aspect to me that is very compelling. And I think that there's a lot that can be really exploded into the open around this and really exposed to the public if we can get to what the root of Ghislaine going after somebody like Cousteau is. This is the key point, and that's why the hot zone politics are really going to open this story up. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special report. We're going deep here, and we're going to now switch over and jump on to this whole bit about William Barr and his dad. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. This is maybe the perfect time for us to do that. It's a free newsletter, and it keeps that pipeline going between us. While we're getting into all this, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Gypsy Moon, wasn't LBJ's gang a master of sex blackmail? Also, wasn't one of the main gems in Liddy's gemstone operation?
Yeah, I did bring up Bobby Baker's operation. That's LBJ's whole group that, worked that blackmail thing. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover is the master of the control file. So this thing goes all the way back. And they say that FDR and the group around FDR was involved in that. So in the 20s and 30s. So this is just something that continued and grew out. But at a certain point where it's so institutionalized, certain heir apparents have to be chosen. And that's where we're going to get into with our friend Epstein. Let's take a quick look on Epstein. And of course, we're going to do more hot zone episodes dealing with the strangeness around Sanders. And I may use the information I have from Sanders' circle, even though they can't go any further with it. And there's still a few people on that family side I'm waiting to get more info from. I do feel like people get spooked off sometimes dealing with this. My feeling is, timing-wise, it couldn't be more perfect. And, if a number of these things took place in the 60s and 70s, bringing them out now would be very important. But it's just like the JFK records and the story I told about Judge Napolitano and us talking to Trump when he was supposed to release the Assassination Record Review Board had mandated their release in 1992 for 2017, 25 years later, and on October 26th. And Trump didn't do it, although he released about 3,000 files. None of the CIA important files were in there. And Napolitano, who was on friendly terms with Trump then, although that's changed over time, he went ahead and said, look, you have to release this stuff. Don't treat us like children. You promised me personally you were going to do it. You even campaigned on it. What is this? And Trump was very reluctant. I can't do it. I've seen all this stuff and I can't do it. And then Napolitano was like, well, that's outrageous. I mean, what did you see? What's the problem? And he said, Andrew, if you saw what I saw in there, you wouldn't release them either. So there's a big problem there with what's residing in those files and for the deep state. And Trump didn't feel like he could cross that line with it. That's pretty interesting. And Barr may have something to do with that. Barr's cover-up of those records goes all the way back to 1976. So we're talking about somebody, again, like Rumsfeld, who comes in as Attorney General, Barr, but he comes in way before Trump's Attorney General. He's Attorney General for Bush. Then, he's like the youngest Attorney General and then one of the oldest, right? So he shows up just like Rumsfeld, one of the youngest defense secretaries and then one of the oldest. This is an interesting step over time. And in this case, we're looking at 30 years between when he was chosen for Bush and when he was chosen for Trump. And there was a lot of talk at that time, too, I want to point out, but there was all this funeral stuff, or, who's handing who a message, and why did the Clintons look so upset, and so forth. Because I think what was arranged with the Bushes at that point, which was that the Bushes would get their Attorney General in there, and that this whole Russian nonsense, which had been cooked up by the Clintons, would go away. And that seems to be what happened, because for me, Barr was a strange choice on Trump's side, unless there's something we don't know. Okay. Did Bill Barr cover up the JFK records? This is the question. And did he do it through this enigmatic figure that we know about, George Ioannidis? So this is going to dovetail directly with Ghislaine and Epstein, because it is, of course, Barr's father who appoints Epstein to his first most important job. And a few weird things that go on around the Barr family anyway. As you know, our intense research around CERN, for example, with Dr. Farrell and others, and Chi-Chi Young. And what we find there about CERN is, yes, it has the front of a scientific study program, but what is it really? What's going on there? Why are there all the rumors about occult rituals and videotape of mock human sacrifices and things like that? Why do we have a whole tapestry, for example, CERN Tarot, and all these things around it? So it's very unusual. And also its budget is very unusual. For a scientific project, $22 billion, off the charts. But this thing just got reactivated literally a few days ago. So now we're in the middle of this thing again. And, when it first got activated, the Large Hadron Collider, which is all about, hey, we're going to smash particles together and find out how the universe was made and find the God particle, which they pretended to find in 2012 to keep the funding going, Higgs boson. But we have to understand something about CERN, which is it's got a history. It's actually a nuclear research organization. And it has a history that goes all the way back to, in the late 50s, John J. McCloy signing on and getting their funding going. And McCloy, a real mover and a shaker, and on the Warren Commission and Chase Manhattan. I mean, we have that deep thing going on with CERN, which would be very different than an astronomy project or a physics project. I mean, this is more like a military development. So have we discovered the God particle? Look at that name there of the author of this. That is Stephen Barr. Well, who is that? Well, it's particle physics scientist Stephen Barr, who is the brother of Attorney General Barr and the son of course, the Barr who appointed our friend Epstein to his first job, Donald. Now, a couple of things about Donald. One, he wrote a book in 1973, which was a space age thriller, which included all of these unusual sexual shenanigans and involved, one of the main characters who's a teen gets raped, for example. And there's a whole thing about rape in relation to eugenics. I mean, it's a very kind of twisted book, for sure. That's the cover of the book, and that's his protege. Oddly enough, his protege ends up almost acting out the contents of the book. That, of course, is Jeffrey Epstein. Let's read a little bit about the book, shall we? In the future, humans have formed an intergalactic empire ruled by aristocrats. World Economic Forum. During a time of war with the Plith, an empire of ant-like alien bug people, Ambassador John Craig, a formerly liberal Earthman in his 30s, is dispatched to the strategically important planet Kosar, a human colony that was settled by the Carlisle Society in the place of exile, as a place of exile for political extremists. Note the name Carlisle is just like the Carlisle Group, who bought the JFK library. Their boredom, they're big. The Carlisle Group is a big Bush think tank. Their boredom and absolute power have driven them to madness to the point that Kosar's entry into the empire has been stymied by the man-inhabited planet's treaties clause against alliances with slave-owning societies due to its practice of kidnapping humans to become illegal playthings to the galaxy's super rich. Craig, who is now campaigning to bring Kosar into the empire, had previously been to the planet when the passenger ship on which he was traveling on a return trip from the Betelgeuse conference was captured by space pirates. While en route to Kosar, one of the pirates awakened Craig and the other prisoners to rape a 15-year-old virginal redheaded female captive in front of them. Sorry for the disturbing nature of this, but this is his book. The rapist's fellow pirates later hear of this and dock his pay as punishment for spoiling her market value. So, and it goes on more, and there's a whole bit that there's a plan for an alien invasion, and Craig is the hero who uncovers this. So there's all sorts of there's a kind of sadism that outlines the book as well. But this is interesting again because this is Donald Barr. And now he's going to have a son who is big on the CERN front. He's going to have another son who is the Attorney General under President Bush and who will be the CIA's general counsel in the 70s, protecting them from the Kennedy inquiries. So we have to understand a couple of things there, which is our lack of knowledge of what they've done with space since they removed Kennedy and haven't gone back to the moon in 50 years. And we also need to understand the intelligence agencies and how they operate in relation to things that the public is not aware of. And three, I would say what's crucial is there always seems to be around the intelligence agency part a kind of twisted sexual practice of some sort. So all those things are active in this guy's book, and the characters indeed start to line up exactly like Epstein and Maxwell. And if you kind of go through that, even people in the mainstream media who like to blow off those types of associations are like, yeah, those associations are there, but they don't mean anything. But even they cannot deny how unusual that is. So then let's go back again to that Belial cult and what their beliefs are. Where are they coming from? And what their object is. Well, we can get a lot by looking at Donald Barr's background. Donald Barr served in the OSS, which is the first early version of the Central Intelligence Agency, but it had a war purpose. So I would say the OSS sort of, whereas the CIA was made up whole cloth out of legal, it was the elite legal law firms on the East Coast, in New York in particular, S&C. And the whole idea was about dealing and representing international finance. And they got that into government. The OSS was still working with a war footing, so it was a little bit different, although they engaged in their own unusual practices. But anyway, he came out of that. Following the conflict, he returned to Columbia, where he earned an MA in English and so on, sociology, all this kind of stuff. Columbia University Science Honors Program, School of Engineering, National Science Foundation. So he's around this science milieu. He was the headmaster at Dalton School from 1964 to 1974, 10 years. During this time as Dalton's headmaster, Barr had a role in hiring future financier and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein as a math teacher, despite the fact that Epstein, who graduated from high school at the age of 16, had failed to complete his degree and was only 21 years old. So he's being positioned and placed in this elite school by Barr for a reason. But Barr is so deep in collusion with that covert aspect, CIA and all the rest, that his son is the counsel, is the main lawyer for the Central Intelligence Agency in the 70s. And his job is to get rid of any mention of the Kennedy assassination records. This is William Barr, who becomes Trump's attorney general. That's why we're on a winding road here, because as we're into the whole J6 thing and, you know, the nonsense of the circus of what they're saying now, this whole thing about Trump, you know, beating up his own Secret Service people and having to relax by listening to music from the Cats musical. This thing gets really great. You know, but Barr serves as a weird purpose because he was there to kind of make sure that the deep state interests were served while Trump was in office. The Dalton School aspect is absolutely crucial. And Barr published, of course, Space Relations in 1973. So we're getting hints. The hints are very strong there about what was going on with these people. Ghislaine Maxwell was known for a long-standing friendship with Prince Andrew. This is important as well because the royal family is crucial in all this. That's a big piece. It's almost harder to expose than the deep state aspect in America. And it cannot be emphasized enough that that aspect needs to come out in order for us to understand this piece as well, because they're all heavily, the entire royal cover is heavily involved in this. This is the point I wanted to point out, though, about that. She basically, Ghislaine became, you know, this kind of social mistress for Prince Andrew. She introduced Epstein to Prince Andrew, and the three often socialized together. In 2000, Maxwell and Epstein attended a party thrown by Prince Andrew at the Queen's Sandringham House estate in Norfolk, England, reportedly for Maxwell's 39th birthday. In a November 2019 interview, Prince Andrew confirmed that Maxwell and Epstein had attended the event at his invitation, but he denied there was anything more than a straightforward shooting weekend. Yeah, I bet. In 1995, Epstein named one of his companies the Ghislaine Corporation. Think about the ties there. And we haven't even touched heavily on Robert Maxwell, who's Ghislaine's dad, and her family. But the level of kind of deep state involvement is worldwide, because you're dealing with not only the Central Intelligence Agency and its global network, but you're dealing with Mossad and you're dealing with these other pieces. However, over and over again, regardless of that whole piece, what actually keeps coming up is scientists involved in Atlantis and in unearthing this remnant of this Belial culture as some sort of right. This is the piece that's missing, and this is what can inform our understanding of what's really happening. So when we see somebody like Ghislaine up for trial, we don't just say, ha, you know, you're getting yours, you sex trafficker. That's very true, actually. And it is good. It is justice that she's getting prosecuted. But let's go deeper. What is that? What is she the face of? What does she actually represent? Beyond, you know, just Epstein being a pimp to, you know, the high-class socialites. It's very, very different. It's a much deeper story. in fact, and Lolita Island doesn't cut it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep here with a special report on Ghislaine Maxwell, the British socialite, as they like to describe her, and her sentencing. We're going to be taking your questions here very shortly, and I'd say we go about another half hour tonight. How do you feel about that?
Sounds good.
We've got this Wednesday night special report on the timing. We have a great interview coming up for you on Friday, and then the X series returns a week from Friday in the midst of all that. July 4th. Hoo-ha, that's going to be going down. I wanted to mention that, there was this really crazy San Diego UFO sighting, and some of the footage floating around of this thing is very compelling, I would say. And I've already seen some unusual efforts to discredit it, and I'm starting to wonder about that, especially in relation to the fact that it's so close to Coronado, which is a place and a location we've emphasized here, again, north of Grumman, and these other people putting together the Tic Tac displays, the USS Nimitz, which is docked close by. And you have these pilots come on and they say, oh, I saw this thing, it was after me. And then, you have the CIA organized UFO units coming out and saying, well, don't you believe Navy pilots? Well, yeah, you scared them to death by using Northrop Grumman's technology. Yeah, I believe that. But certainly there's real UFO activity out there. There's just a huge effort on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency and other intelligence agencies, but specifically them, to exploit the UFO threat aspect. So I think that the San Diego sighting is one to watch. I'll put that on the record here. I'm going to remind everyone where the hot zone is. All right, so we know what the hot zone is now. It's an area where no one can discuss the ruins that they see. It's too hot to handle, basically. You have Bimini up here with where Casey said there's an Atlantean temple rising, and basically this is a whole two-eye stone station. This is Cuba and the western tip of Cuba, and there we have the Yucatan Peninsula. Those three areas constitute the hot zone, and also, all around here getting into the Bahamas, and you're right on the outskirts and intertwining with the Bermuda Triangle. Those things are important because if we're to take the Casey story at face value, that whatever it was that took place there that caused such a devastation, and as we can, people say, oh, there's a great comet that hit, or the poles shifted and things like that. There's no question that these things took place, but what he was talking about, and he references them as well, he talks about something else. He talks about this power station basically blowing everything down. And the same type of technology that they were using to conquer gravity was in reverse. So it was pulling things under. That's how the whole island goes down. In Plato's description of Atlantis, which he plays out in a very straight ahead fashion. It does not play like a fantasy story at all, except at the end he says, Atlantis was destroyed in a day and a night. Well, an EMP style devastation would destroy a continent in a day and a night. It wouldn't take, it wouldn't happen over time. Another thing that I think is crucial, if we're going to just speak about the Atlantis part to get ourselves on the same wavelength as how these people think, is that section by Bimini that apparently stretched from Bimini all the way over to Yucatan via that what Polina Zalitsky found on the western tip of Cuba to Yucatan was a mountain range underwater. So that whole thing was still above ground. So Atlantis sinks, and there's this kind of outpost left over of Poseidia. And so we have to kind of think of that as a gradual sinking while all this other stuff is happening. But the idea of Atlantis, basically, that the mystery schools give us through the Casey work and anthroposophy, theosophy, and others, is the Gulf of Mexico on one side, the Mediterranean on the other. It's the Atlantic Ocean throughout. So you're going all the way over to Spain, the UK, and coming all the way over to, the coast of Florida, for example. But it is this section that of Poseidia that Casey emphasizes so heavily. I think that's crucial. And we're going to find out that basically, that's where they spent all their time, in the hot zone. And even Epstein Island is right there in the midst of all that. It's a perfect perch from which to get that intel. Jacques Cousteau, I mentioned him, and I think many of the revelations are going to come about what was happening with him and what was happening with his daughter and her ocean project. Notice the hand again, and then think of the hand of our friend here, Marvin Minsky. This is all very much steganography of a high order that they're going for. But Minsky and Cousteau were two that were targeted by this group, and they were both very interested in Atlantis. So we need to understand why those groups were after them. And we need to kind of connect those dots for ourselves. The way to do it is through the figure of Margaret Adams. And that's why, the colonel's daughter becomes very important in all this. All right. So we've done our piece on Barr. Let's remember happier days when exploiting everybody before everybody knew about it. That's quite a couple, quite an interesting trail they have left in their wake. There's a shot of Robert Maxwell, and we're going to save Maxwell because I'm doing something very special in relation to Robert Maxwell. But let's not forget his strange death near the Canary Islands, floating naked on the side of his yacht. And of course, he had set up a yacht for Ghislaine and called it Lady Ghislaine. Mm-hmm. So there's a big ocean-faring culture relation to all this, and that also stretches to L. Ron Hubbard, by the way.
Whoa!
So that is another piece of all this.
All right, let me ask you this right now.
Yes.
Debbie Klingelsmith wants to know: do you think Ghislaine, and not Epstein, was actually the ringleader through her father?
No, I think the ringleader was deeper than both of them. I think that they found a collaborative interest in that he wanted to kind of reanimate those connections, because when the father died, it came out that he had defrauded all of these people through this publishing company. The publishing company publishing these scientific books is also very unusual, because if you go back to some of their early charters, they're studying right in that area of the hot zone. They're studying the ocean. So, I've put together those pieces over time that these scientific groups were engaged, just like Egerton Sykes said, hey, the intelligence groups know all about those ruins, but, it's nothing they can ever talk about publicly. When we find in 1958 that President Eisenhower was demanding from Spain the original map that the Pura Reis was drawn from, you're in weird territory. That these were, kind of coming up to levels of diplomacy which concern national security, talking about an ancient map. What's going on there? And that takes us into interesting territory. This picture will take us into interesting territory. I think you're going to find that seeing our friend Stephen Hawking there, and the fact that Maxwell and Epstein created a custom-made submarine named Atlantis just for him to go underwater and look at what they had found is very compelling. What are these level of scientists doing hanging out with these people? What's behind that? And what are they looking for? When we had all those visitors going to Antarctica, it becomes like, what is it that you're doing when you do this behind closed doors? And if they're going in there and checking these things out on this level, that they need to maintain a type of secrecy which is ironclad, which comes from, a kind of Masonic level of secrecy. This is how they kept the UFO file secret initially through Vannevar Bush, who, by the way, was the Grand Master of the MIT Mason Lodge. He had learned those occult rules of secrecy through his many years being a Mason, and he applied them directly to shepherding the UFO file. Well, this is the same type of thing. So when we get this and we're seeing these people on Epstein Island, and they are, getting ready to participate in these TerraMar sub searches of underwater and the ruins that they found there in the hot zone, we have to see that, we're looking at the highest level of scientific inquiry. Think of Gates, even in his relationship with Epstein, because, Gates, you would think, is a careful enough person, having got to where he is. But you also see that these people had to be involved with Epstein and Maxwell in order to be able to have access to this thing. So they would take those chances. Somebody like Clinton, might be enough of a psychopath to think he can get away with anything. But I don't know with some of the other ones. And in fact, I think their public image did suffer greatly, of course, after the fact. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. But when you think about Hawking and, his disability and everything else, that's not somebody who you're saying we're going to get sex blackmail on. So there's something else going on there. And it has to do with what? They want his opinion on what they've discovered in relation to this ancient culture. The idea of reanimating the Belial cult from Atlantis, this piece is what I think we can draw around their activities. That's what the crucial part is. And of course, understanding what that Belial represents is also crucial. Now I have one more piece and then we get to your questions. How's that? How's everything out there?
Great.
Yeah, anything else?
Syrianification says, I'd like to mention that Ghislaine did some recruiting at Disneyland and Disney World. She hosted some talent show contests. There are photos of her standing on the stage announcing the winners.
Interesting. Yeah, well, anything like that, send to me at admin@darkjournalist.com because, and if you have the dates, that would be very helpful. Extremely helpful. Routing and record sheet. Oh, yeah. All right. So one thing I wanted to say about the destruction of records that relates to Barr and Bush is that I found a letter that is from 1975. And no, it's from May 76, but it relates to 1975. And so what they were doing is they were placing on the record an effort that would legalize them destroying records in relation to the Kennedy assassination. This is something that Bush, when he became director of the CIA in 76, wanted to establish so that they could retroactively release all those people. But also they wanted to get rid of whatever is in the JFK assassination files without getting prosecuted for it. So obviously there's some double check relating to those JFK records, and Barr and Bush were engaged in this activity now in 1976, trying to remove whatever it was. And of course, we have Trump later apologizing to Napolitano and saying, whatever mechanism is left in there, I can't release. So somebody, and I was thinking it was Robert Kennedy after JFK's death, left something that was a mechanism that when the records came out, that they couldn't be removed. This is the thing. So in this very unusual letter to Mike Mansfield, Senator Mansfield, Bush is pressing on this request. The agency has placed in effect a complete moratorium on the destruction of records, including normal administrative records scheduled for routine destruction. The purpose of this letter is to advise you that it is our intention to proceed with the destruction of records. Now that the Select Committee has completed its investigation and issued a final report, we have so advised Senator Frank Church, who brought up the matter. You need these records. We need to know what happened, and we need to know the CIA's involvement in the Kennedy assassination. This is the level of openness they were at in the 70s, and it got glossed over, but it keeps coming back up somehow. And even with the Trump non-release of the records, that is another wave of this. So there's something in those records, again, just hardcore. The agency will destroy records which were collected and maintained by the agencies and subject to investigation by the Rockefeller Commission and the Senate Committee. The agency is required to destroy the latter material. Of course, all record destructions will be fully consistent with applicable laws. That's George Bush director. So what they're after there is the legal plausibility for destroying the JFK assassination records. Here's the interesting thing. It didn't happen. The records are still there, and every president comes up to it. I'm going to release it, and it doesn't happen. So, we're in strange territory with it. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, I'm going to start with Najat. She says, in the photo with Jeffrey and Ghislaine, she is making an X-steganography with her hands and arms. Have you seen that picture?
I think I showed it. Isn't that the whole point? Yeah, that's pretty interesting. There's a lot of steganography. What I noticed about her is she's very good at sending signals by saying things. And we went through her very unusual diatribe from prison in an episode a few months, and it was very much like, I'm feeling like, I should be, she talks all about this imaginary friend, and these things are very telling, I think. And I don't like to run around looking for steganography. I just know it when I see it. And I often get a lot of it when dealing with her. Yes.
Okay. Mind Control Inc. DJ. Are there Project Monarch ties / connections to the Maxwell Epstein team?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. Robert Maxwell is such a deep intel player. He may be somebody who's actually like a double or triple agent. And in fact, may have had so many enemies by the end that the only way out for him was, getting bumped off on his yacht. But his getting killed in that fashion, and then the bankruptcy hitting the family and all the rest of it, and then the unusual activities of the family getting into very hardcore software that was operated and utilized by intelligence agencies. And then this aspect, which is, the scientific aspect with really Epstein and Maxwell coming right up here. I've even tried to retrace their steps to the offices because I know of 2 different Harvard offices that they visited and that they were funding research for. So, we've got something where they were tightly interwoven. There's on the record pieces about Epstein directing different scientists, saying that he wanted to impregnate as many women with his super genes as, putting together a program for it, even artificial insemination. So this is unusual in itself. Go ahead.
Do we know if he did this at all?
Well, I think that I'm certain that he did it. The idea of it being on record, though, isn't there. But the plans to do it and the people that he talked with about doing it, and then later they would say, oh, we didn't know what he was up to.
Because what's amazing is that, although I don't have Netflix anymore, there is a show on Netflix about a fertility doctor who did this. He has hundreds of children. It's called Our Father.
Yes.
So it has been done.
No question. And we've seen that as a thread. I mean, of course, Mengele is very classic. Dr. Death there from Hitler's reign, who escaped to Argentina. And then there are all these stories because of the different things that he did and some of the things that his son helped bring to light about him. But one of the things is that he would adopt a whole different persona, go into this South American village and be the doctor, the local doctor. And suddenly everybody started having blonde-haired, blue-eyed children. And you know what's weird? When they got older and older, they all looked the same. It was like this thing about twins. And, strangely enough, there were all sorts of these groups of twins in these different villages where he was operating with this pseudonym. So there's no question that... this goes back to, and I think that it takes us into the Pasadena realm. We're not going to be able to get into that in this show, but I've pointed out Pasadena as a very central location for this and the Whole World Eugenics Foundation originally in 1913 and what it was connected with. So when you look at that material, you start to see that, Caltech and some of the unusual things going on in relation to people who came out of there, like Parsons, like Hodel. There's a weird piece of it that's connected with a mythology about, in the case of the episode that we did on Caltech, the Sun King, for example, is part of it. So, in the Hitler background, it's the Superman, it's the Aryan Superman. So they're obsessed with improving the breed, but their ideas are coming from an occult wellspring about it. And that is the deep edge of the left-hand path mystery schools. This is the thing that on the surface we're not aware of. So if we just hear about something like, oh, there's a Satanist group or there's an occultist group or whatever, and we just think, oh, secret societies, it's a bunch of evil people or whatever. But the idea that there's a split, that there's a whole secret society that is, the mystery schools are trying to push the culture forward using the spiritual tools that they have, and that both sides have these different tools in this toolkit, and they're both utilizing it for their own purposes. What's interesting is if you get into Steiner's description of the mystery schools, you find that his description is of light schools, and then, sort of gray schools, then dark, then very dark, So, and the way he describes them is right-hand path, somewhat right-hand path, which are the good schools, and then the left-hand path, and then extreme left-hand path. And the extreme left-hand path would fall under this kind of Satanism thing, whereas somebody just doing the left-hand path doesn't necessarily have to be a Satanist. They could be on a certain type of trip with the left-hand material. So there are apparently gradations in relation to that split. But certainly the mystery schools that kept the information around Atlantis, kept the information of the story of humanity, and this whole thing about aliens or interdimensionals and all that, that's a big piece in there. And the group that comes out with that, they feel now that they're being compelled, just as Steiner described a mystery school battle that took place in the 1840s, where information had to come out because the right-hand schools were compelled to release it because they felt the scientific materialism was going to draw humanity ever further down into materialism, and said in 100 years we won't recognize humanity. So they made that decision then. And now, faced with this same thing coming out, I think what's happening is that you're seeing very low-level attempts by the left-hand schools to pirate these themes and say, oh, we have UFO disclosure, and guess what? It's connected with undersea disclosure and interdimensionals. And the CIA is trying to say, like, we're going to give you, the origin story of humanity on Mars. This is a very tricky place because everybody's operating with secrecy, even on the good side. And the worst thing you can do is accept that kind of propaganda from those types of groups. I mean, intelligence agencies are the biggest liars on the public stage. That's all there is to it. It's proven fact. And we're dealing with their lies on a daily basis. We can't even get records about a presidential assassination from 59 years ago. So those people aren't interested in giving you the truth about UFOs or anything else, or Atlantis. Wake up. Yes.
Richard Hastings, why do the most evil have such a wide multidimensional network? Who are their enablers? Who are their masters?
Well, their enablers, it's very interesting because I was discussing this with Catherine Fitz, and, we have part 3 of Catherine coming out tomorrow. This is really interesting, too, because one of the things we get into is how small a group it is that is initiating the policy, and how they implement it through a wide range of different types of people. But just look at the COVID off. It's a few people who decided it, and then they implemented it through governors who didn't have the ability or the legal authority to do the things that they did with lockdowns, et cetera. And other governors who bragged and said, oh, we're going to do martial law. You don't have the authority to do martial law. You have a legislature, and you sign laws. You don't make laws as governors. So, we got into some very, very anti-constitutional territory in Canada. We're still seeing them, do that type of thing. Oh, we're just taking away guns, So in America, there is a constitutional system, and every single official signs on and swears an oath to that Constitution. You can't break that unless you get rid of the idea of the United States. And that's why Homeland and Homeland Security are used, et cetera. So I would say it's heavily, heavily compartmentalized But I think where these things come tumbling down, these talk about trickle-down economics. This is trickle-down fascism, right? It comes from this very small group with incredibly dangerous consequences. Yes.
Orphic Egg. Hey, don't forget Ghislaine's dad was involved in Promise/Inslaw, which got Danny Casolaro suicided and was a precursor to Prism. And that involves the octopus, right?
Well, you're going to be very happy to know that there's an X-Series episode coming up this summer on Michael Riconosciuto, and that will open up Promise software. And it is, you're absolutely right. Maxwell's connection with that is obvious. And what is that? That is hijacking the software from Hamilton and bringing that thing out through all of these different countries, the United States giving them that software. And, the company that made the software is like, hey, what's going on here? And the Justice Department comes down on them. It's like, shut up. And it's an incredible, incredible story. And of course, Casolaro got mixed up in that. Casolaro got mixed up in one thing, which also pertains to what we're talking about tonight, which is there was a weapon used. And this gets into very tricky territory, but basically they were testing a weapon on Indian land, Native American sanctuary. And people who were exposing that ended up, losing their lives. And so there's a whole thing about Wackenhut in relation to that piece. So when we talk about Casolaro, you're really getting into these deep state wars, and it has to do with advanced weaponry. That's really kind of one of the big secrets around it. But what an incredible chapter. And Casolaro was so smart because he knew that he was at risk for these things. So what did he do? He hid messages in his shoes so that if anything had happened to him, as it did, people would know where to look. Absolutely fascinating. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special report. Just incredible. And looking at some of the brave reporters that have gone in the past, we know that we have an incredible legacy of brave people on the independent side working for these things. And I often talk about the X-Share, and not just to emphasize the X-Protect groups who try to suppress these things, but I identify people like JFK and Thomas Townsend Brown as part of a group called X-Share, sometimes referred to as X-Reveal. And they are concerned with opening the culture up to these things. James Forrestal was another one who said, we can't have the CIA just take this over, and we need to use the UFO file wisely. These types of things, and those people getting bumped off in succession so that this group can operate with the wall of secrecy and manipulate humanity. The X-Share group is there as well. It's very powerful, and it's operational on the public stage. And I think that the people that we see on the front lines, it's a great idea to support them in the work that they do, fighting this thing that's coming in. And I have to say, America seems to be the focal point of their efforts and activities. So if we need, heroes, we certainly need them now. Yes.
Leslie Oliver. Why did they throw Epstein and Maxwell under a bus? The first case with Virginia Roberts exploded onto the media, but why did they allow that? Remember, the media is controlled 100%.
Well, they rolled it out, though, in a way that was containable. Just like grabbing Ghislaine, they sort of hung around on it for a while. I think they were trying to make a deal with her. Can you imagine the level of material that she has available to her from being Epstein's partner? If Epstein was naming corporations after her. I found out that TerraMar actually had an address over in Woburn. How far is Woburn from here? Maybe
25 minutes.
This thing was centralized. And what's fascinating to me is that Minsky had spent a lot of time and even taught up in New Hampshire. And I wonder if one of the reasons Maxwell ended up going to New Hampshire and getting a house and hiding out there was because of that Minsky thing, because New Hampshire seemed like a weird move for her. and I know she was staying at Manchester by the Sea in lovely, up north there. But when she starts using Janet Atlantis Marshall, when she's out there doing this, she's in New Hampshire. And, that's an interesting key too, because you look at that and you say, what's she doing up there in New Hampshire? Yes.
There is a comment about Janet Atlantis. Oh, here we go. Gypsy Moon. Aren't Janet planes the ones that go to Area 51?
That's true. Yes, Janet. Starting to think about what Janet is all about. Janet Airlines. And they're under a certain lid of secrecy. It's fascinating, too, when you think about it. A lot of people around the Las Vegas piece, Harry Reid, George Knapp and all the UFO stuff that comes out of there, and all the coverage that he did, which was breakthrough coverage at the time, right? The 90s coverage that was going on. It's so interesting because we recently had this exchange in Congress that I've pointed out, which was a congressman from Illinois, the Republican congressman from Illinois, and he was asking, Moultrie, the Defense Department official, shouldn't there be some penalty for these amateur interest UFO groups for researching this subject? What kind of penalties can we put together there, Honorable Mr. Moultrie? And Moultrie says, well, that's a good point. I think I can work with Congress and work out a series of penalties for people who are interested in UFOs because they're messing up the narrative, right? That guy who was asking those questions, although he's the Republican congressman from Illinois now, he used to be the United States attorney in Las Vegas. So, those people, they're heavy into protecting that UFO secret. And when you see them coming out and being like, the phony whistleblowers and things like that, like Elizondo and this whole claptrap, and then using people like Knapp and the rest to promote them, you're in deep soup when you have that going on, because those people are up to something in relation to the UFO file. They're up to creating a false UFO threat and centralizing that emergency powers to combat a global threat. And that is a crucial piece for us to be looking at. And I think emergency powers is exactly how these people envision ruling, because they can't get popular support on a level where you can govern. And so I think this is a lot of what we're looking at. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special report. Incredible action tonight. We're going to do about 10 more minutes of questions, and then we'll leave you for tonight because it's a special report. Great to have everyone here with us in the Ideas Room. I did mention we're going to have a special interview coming up for you on Friday, and then a week from Friday, we're back with the X series. Miss Olivia.
Okay, Erica Swinson Elliott. Theory: Ghislaine and Jeffrey's sacrifice was to protect Moneybags Wexner of Victoria's Secret, his angels, ex-steganography messaging.
Interesting. I was reading a lot about Wexner, and Wexner does play a really key role with this. And later, he was the chief financier and enabler of Epstein. And so we have to really think about his role and Victoria's Secret. But what's fascinating is I did find a piece of ex-steganography with him, which is that he called his ranch in Ohio Xanadu. But Wexner at the end would play that whole, Bill Gates card of like, oh, I didn't know what this man was up to, and, all that nonsense. Epstein himself, I wondered, he knew all the cards were in the air at the end. And I seriously wonder if he didn't have something like a dead man switch somewhere, and if this wasn't the aim of, sort of keeping those cameras down. Were they interrogating him at the end? Were they getting that information? Whatever it was, he was in possession of incredible knowledge, and I think that they wanted to determine before they prosecuted Maxwell how much she knew. And as somebody else pointed out, Maxwell is such a deep operator. In a way, she's almost as deep or deeper than Jeffrey, because why? Because Robert Maxwell has a whole generation there of his deep dealing with Mossad and everything else. And let's not forget his state funeral in Israel. Well, that's not something that's given out every day. I got a couple more pictures here. Jeffrey Epstein bragged Bill Barr was in charge, not Trump. That's interesting. That's some of the end dialogue of Epstein. What was he talking about? How did he think that Barr was in charge, not Trump? This is pretty compelling. Epstein told Ehud Barak, leadership in Israel, that he had direct knowledge that Barr was in charge in D.C., according to a new book that also claims Steve Bannon gave Epstein advice on his PR strategy, including the fact that they were setting up an interview with Rachel Maddow. She would have loved that. Good old honest Rachel. So that's compelling. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Deborah Blair, as with Hollywood, the handlers of Epstein and Maxwell and others are warning that all can be sacrificed if they are out of line. No one can get out of line. Atlantis is owned.
Oh, it's so true. Well, we've seen even in cases like Cosby or Harvey Weinstein, the threats and the things that have gone on. I remember reading about Ronan Farrow and how they had set up these Israeli private intelligence firms once he started going into the Weinstein case. Do you remember this?
Yeah, I do. I read his book.
That was public too. This is a pretty big revelation, but Hollywood is major in relation to it because the CIA is dominant, Department of Homeland Security, and all the rest. But that history of running that goes back a long time.
Well, I mean, that's the message with JFK, right? Is anybody can be gotten to, right?
Yes.
No one is untouchable.
Yes, really true. Let's see what else I got. Ghislaine Maxwell abruptly torpedoed her oceanic nonprofit in the wake of the scandal surrounding her associate, Jeffrey Epstein. That was TerraMar. And we have not got the full story of TerraMar, but TerraMar was the front for what they were doing in the hunt for Atlantis with Hawking and all the rest.
It was Black Cube is the name of that organization.
Exactly,
right?
Black Cube.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Bingo. And now I have something else in here. I had a picture of that I don't want to end the evening without showing. It's a picture of Maxwell. Hold on. Keep going, Bubba.
Leanne Verrier, do you have any insights regarding the connection between Prince Andrew and Maxwell? I suspect that Andrew was targeted because of his position in the monarchy. A lot of people are saying Prince Andrew's next. He's going to be the next domino to fall.
Oh, wow. Andrew's in an unbelievable position of exposure. He has been exposed, and Jeffrey, again, is the conduit of that. She's put Andrew on the line, and she's put our friend Cousteau on the line. So that is, I think, really major and completely unplanned on their side. So where they go with it is going to be absolutely compelling. All right, one more.
We can only imagine. I mean, it is like Game of Thrones, right? These power groups literally behind the throne that, we don't understand the kind of brokering, the brinksmanship, the everything that's going on behind the scenes, of if you do this, then, the threats,
Mm-hmm.
and as they're smiling up there and, supposedly partying together and shaking hands for the cameras and stuff. I mean, I think it's a death match, really, like behind the scenes between these power
No question. Well, we saw that. You saw with LBJ and JFK, LBJ was actively plotting against him. So when we think about that, he still has to go through all the motions. And I think JFK's solution to it was to send him off on these foreign trips. And it's interesting because everyone wondered when LBJ accepted the vice presidency why he was doing it, because the vice presidency was known to be the big nothing position. And he was the Senate majority leader, for heaven's sake. He could get all kinds of things through that position. And he had run for president and used very dirty tricks to break into Kennedy's, doctor's office looking for anything that he could use to show that, hey, Kennedy, is hiding something from the public. And he was looking for information that didn't exist about Kennedy having Crohn's disease. And what's interesting is he would tell one of his best friends, who was interested in why he wanted to be VP, that Kennedy wasn't going to live very long. That's before they got in office. That's pretty unusual. And the person automatically assumed it was based on Johnson's rumors about Kennedy having, this disease or that. But later, it shows up very strangely. And when you think about it, LBJ wasn't going to hang around for 8 years while Kennedy was president. So something unusual was going on there. Okay, here's the picture I wanted to show. This is Donald Barr on one side and Jeffrey Epstein when he hired him for a math teacher. Take a look at this. That.
Wow.
First of all, look at the expression on Barr's face. I mean, that's a very, very devious looking guy. And then our friend Epstein, hey, man, he just barely finished high school. If they want to roll him in with no degree into this incredibly posh situation, somebody connected that up. And we know that Barr facilitated it, but we don't know who connected it in the first place. That's a key to understanding who the players in the deep state are. I'm going to finish with this, which is a quote from Edgar Cayce on what the two-eye stone was, and then we'll take one more question in a row. Okay. First of all, this is the thing in question. Now, a NASA... What you got?
They're calling him Barbarino.
So there's a NASA engineer in the 70s becomes fascinated by the Cayce ratings. And he decides, I'm going to make my own scale model of this thing. But first I have to draw up what it would have looked like based on the readings. This is what he came up with. 6-sided. And what he realized later is also that the top was the Star of David, which, so that persists after the fact into the Jewish mysticism and Jewish religion. Here's what Cayce had to say about the two-eye stone. You ready? And then we'll take one more question.
Okay.
We're off. All right. It would be well about the firestone that was in the experience. By the way, the two-eye stone, sometimes called the firestone in the Cayce readings, for a reason, because it appears to be on fire when it's active. Did the activities of the entity then make those applications that dealt with both the constructive and destructive forces in the period? Atlantis. It would be well that there be given something of a description of this. It would be well that there be given something of a description of this, that it may be better understood by the entity in the present, of how both constructive and destructive forces were generated by the activity of this stone. In the center of the building that today would be said to have been lined with non-conductive metals or non-conductive stone, the building above the stone was oval or a dome, wherein there could be or was the rolling back so that the activity of the stone was received from the sun's rays or from the stars, the concentrating of the energies that emanate from bodies that are on fire themselves, with the elements that are found and are not found in the Earth's atmosphere. Weird statement there. The concentration through the prisms or glass, as would be called in the present, was in such a manner that it acted upon the instruments that were connected with the various modes of travel. In Atlantis, they had the high-tech travel. Through induction methods that made much the character of control as the remote control through radio vibrations or directions would be in the present day, and impelled, the stone acted upon the motivating forces of the crafts themselves. They're flying around based on the fact that they have these power stations of the two-eye stone. There was the preparation so that when the dome was rolled back, there might be little or no hindrance in the application direct to the various crafts that were to be impelled through space, whether in the radius of visioning of the one eye, as it might be called, or whether directed underwater or under other elements or through other elements. And this is what Cayce suggests about this kind of apotheum effect that the Atlanteans were able to do. Just like we hear about UFOs going through things, the Atlanteans had craft that could go through mountains, so they can dematerialize, go through it, and come out the other side. or underwater. So this is very, very sophisticated technology. You can see, once they get on this level, how they would want to get their hands on it. The preparations of this stone was in the hands only of the initiates at the time, and the entity was among those that directed the influence of the radiation that arose in the form of the rays that were invisible to the eye, but that acted upon the stones themselves as set the motivating forces, whether aircraft that were lifted by the gases of the period or guiding of pleasure vehicles that might pass along close to the earth, what would be termed crafts on the water or under the water. These were impelled by the concentrating of the rays from the stone that were centered in the middle of the power station or powerhouse, as would be termed in the present. So it's a 2-eye power station. And the various forces, the entity brought destructive forces by setting up in various portions of the land the character that was to act as producing the powers in the various forms of the people's activities in the cities, the towns, the country surrounding same. These not intentionally were tuned too high and brought the second period of destructive forces to the peoples of the land and broke the land into islands that later became the periods for further destructive forces that were brought. Now, so what we have is unintentional use, like in, imagine us setting off an EMP or a nuclear event, having this technology, but this is what they used for everything. So once they set things off, it splits the island into 3, and then eventually it goes even further, and they use it for war. Once they get to that, that's it. It sets off volcanic reactions and possibly even forces the shifting of the poles. Whatever it was that took place back there is an echo, but the groups that were using it, on the one side for positive application, the Amelia's group, but the Belial group, the Sons of Belial, that whole group was obsessed with domination through technology. When we get to Marvin Minsky, when we get to Epstein and these people, they are re-engaging, they are reanimating the Belial theme. And this is, I think, the hidden thing that comes forward when we're dealing with this in relation to, something like the Maxwell trial. We can really open that door because of the cases that are brought up and the things that have happened in the depositions. There's an open window that we won't get through the media, that we won't get through some autobiography or something. It's there in the text if you can read it. And in this case, in Jeffrey's reading of this and putting that out there, who did she give us? Alexandra Cousteau and Minsky. That's crucial. That's what opens the door on that. And with that, Miss Olivia, we'll do the last question.
All right. I'm going to just throw out a couple comments and then ask the question.
Yeah.
Okay, so Leanne Verrier says, putting Maxwell in the throne room and on a bench in the Queen's Holiday Cottage seems significant. Let's remember that. That was definitely significant.
Absolutely.
And Thank You says, also, don't forget, Ghislaine spoke at the UN 7 times.
Yes. It's interesting. I had some quotes about her at the UN, and it's pretty interesting because it's all about ocean safety, this, and how she was setting up passports for people to travel to the ocean. So all that stuff, in my opinion, and her activities for the Clinton Global Initiative, that whole bit is just a cover to continue the Atlantis research in the hot zone. And I think that they were studying oceans as part of their charter and to get their funds and all the rest of it, because there's a whole thing about her in Southeast Asia as well. But my focus, what makes my alarm bell go off is when I see her doing the submarine work and knowing that she has a submarine license, and knowing also that she has a helicopter pilot's license. Those things indicate that she needs to be able to view from the air, to be able to see where the ruins are, one, and then to pilot the submarine to take the scientists down. And who else to choose but her, because she's not going to let that out. Whereas if you hire a pilot and swear them to secrecy, you really don't know what's going to happen. Yes.
Okay. Iwanka K, now we need the name of Maxwell and Epstein's clients. Why the media doesn't bring up the subject? They are also guilty of pedophilia, sexual child abuse, etc. Who are they? Why is there silence about clients? Seriously, the silence is deafening, right?
Oh, no question. I mean, the whole trafficking aspect involved in her story, that, you know, it's so obvious. And now that's the reason that she's been convicted. And so now the list of who she was doing the trafficking to would be the obvious next step. But the media is not interested in that at all. They want you to follow, you know, Johnny Depp.
Well, I mean, like, knowing that it's scandalous, that sex sells, and they're supposedly interested in ratings,
right.
They should be pounding this like crazy.
No
right?
way. No way. I mean, absolutely, they should be. But
and the fact that they're not tells us a lot.
Yeah, under these circumstances, when you think about it, I mean, there's so many things that are obvious that the media does this, you know, complete suppression of the facts around certain cases. The Maxwell case is extraordinary for this. But what's fascinating is whenever something comes up that is crucial, that should be discussed on, you know, a wide basis by the culture. And we talked about it, how there used to be talk shows that would handle any issue. There wouldn't be anything off limits. And, you know, some of those talk shows got really out of hand too. But that's the kind of culture that we had. They would even invite like Nazis and all kinds of people on to talk. Now you can't even say something reasonable. So the idea of collapsing free speech and getting people actually not to even think in those terms is them thinking ahead, because they're looking at these younger generations and they're thinking, how are we going to control these people? We're already having a big problem, and we have to get them to not even think in these terms. That's why one of the things I suggested they were trying to do with 60s culture was, you know, when you reflect back on the 60s, just as a cultural historian, you know, and a lot of people live through it in the ideas room. We hear a lot about it from people. But just thinking about it, what is it? I mean, it's really about the central individuality of a person making their own decisions, defying authority.
Freedom.
Yeah. So this idea of, I'm not saying there weren't problems with the 60s, but that is there. It's like the fire of the human spirit. To me, they want to make that a real museum piece. They don't want that to be something that is remembered and is a legacy of humanity. Even if it went overboard or whatever it was manipulated, or, you know, we know that the CIA ran LSD through the entire hippie community and all the rest of it. But there's something there which, and I've seen this in the music industry, where they're purchasing up and gobbling up Bob Dylan's stuff, or these different, you know, kind of hippie music catalogs. And for me, what they want to make that into a museum so people don't even really think about it. And eventually they can kind of winnow it, splice it out of the culture. It's just like, oh, you know, kind of like the American Revolution. They don't want people to remember Ben Franklin and the rest of it. So yeah, it's a totally different thing.
Yeah, well, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, right? It's that,
yes.
you know,
perfect example.
It's a very, what is the word? Sterile world, right? Of lack of emotion. It's very orderly. It's very organized, right? But
there's no question.
You know, they don't want any chaos, right? They want everything ordered. Just look at China. This is where we're headed.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting too, because what you were talking about with the media, I want to find a better way to describe this, the way that they won't talk about certain things. So under any other circumstances, they would be compelled to talk about it. So if it was any other type of a case, you know, just like the Hunter laptop wasn't talked about, that's intentionally taken down. Twitter blocked the covering of that story. And now the New York Times and all those people admit it. But at the time, 50 intelligence officials, CIA directors, went on the record saying it's Russian disinformation. But they all lied. So where's the public accountability for it? Instead, you have the CIA leading the whole UFO threat thing. And people in the UFO field are like, yay, the CIA wants to give us disclosure. So it's kind of crazy. It's like, you know, either you're informed or you're not. So, you know, what we try to do with dark journalism is make it approachable enough so that somebody can get their hands on it and understand the factors that are involved in manipulating it, so that people walk in unawares, so that basically the intelligence agencies can run the society. This has been their goal since they were set up. And it's not that some nameless agency wants to run things. It's that the groups of extreme wealth that control those agencies that set them up in the first place want that level of control. Here's how Professor Peter Dale Scott explained it to me. I'm an official, and I want to figure out how to satisfy an oil company. An oil company wants to open up a whole fleet of oil tankers in Uzbekistan. But there's no treaty with Uzbekistan, so I don't have any military control. So if that country gets overthrown from within, or there's a nationalist movement, I could lose my investment. So what I do is I go to this official and I say, I want you to guarantee that when we put our oil tankers and all the rest of that refinery process in Uzbekistan, that if anything happens there on a political level, you can neutralize the people involved. This is what happened in Central America, Iran, and other places. That's what they use the Central Intelligence Agency for. It's not that the CIA has some dictum on their own to just control things. They're controlled by the highest level of finance in this world. So that's the deep state. That's what we're talking about in relation to the deep state. What they've been able to do, even with the term deep state, which Professor Peter Dale Scott popularized, is just make it into a Q thing, right? So anything that is against the establishment or against Biden is just a Q fantasy, right? Or if you have some questions about medical processes or the COVID op or anything like that, oh no, that's just Q, right? No, nobody real would question this or Fauci or anything like that. That's where you get into trouble, because in a way it suggests that those groups like the CIA created things like Q, and then the media paid attention to them, or they took an organic movement and exploited it. But whatever it happens to be, they use it as the straw man for a number of these things. This is what we need to be aware of. And, it's so easy on the left to just convince those people and brainwash them with MSNBC that anything that challenges the official statements is just, some crazy right-wing movement of some sort. So that type of brainwashing and entrainment is very dangerous, and people act in the most imbalanced fashion, as we've seen when it comes to these things. So having dark journalism, having some awareness in the media, having that filter can be incredibly valuable. It can even be life-saving on a broad scale. And that's what we're seeing, throughout the awakening that's going on with how the media and the media-backed companies have really created a fictionalized narrative for us, and that we've been living in that fantasy land. And now it's become very dangerous because they're closing in, and we need to, kind of get back our sovereignty by observing the rule of law and by kind of forcing that whole move back. And this is what you see with people going off and pushing back against wokeism and things like that. Well, if wokeism is, turning 8-year-old kids into transvestites, then you can see why people are pushing back on it. And if it involves complete, destruction of a person's individuality and the destruction of the culture, then that's what you're going to get, So there has to be an incredible awakening to push back against that force. And the puppets of those types of forces, like Epstein and Maxwell, we've seen them put forward. And now, they get put up there and we're supposed to hate them and be like, oh, that pedophile or that satanic, whatever. But really, what we're seeing, they're just front people. The system behind them.
It's the system.
Ultimately, it's the system behind them. And with that, Miss Olivia, the last question of the night.
No, I'm going to do 2 more. Okay. So this is a comment first. Lady Blah Blah says, Maxwell became the first person ever to be convicted of trafficking children to nobody. And R. Kelly got a longer sentence, that's 30 years, than Maxwell. I don't get it. And I just wanted to mention, she can be out in 7 years. If she ever goes to jail, right? But for good behavior.
I hear that she's supposed to go to jail in Danbury, Connecticut, which is where they filmed Orange is the New Black. Mm-hmm. How fashionable is that?
Exactly.
There was somebody else who suggested that she was going to serve her time in the UK And they were in the chat before we got started. So if you had any information on that, you can send it to us at admin@darkjournalist.com. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, all right. So I didn't know this, but CERN is firing up again July 5th.
I already announced that.
Okay, all right. I didn't know that.
I did a thing on CERN. Okay.
Okay,
Yes, that's
so
good. I'm glad everyone's
so
aware
these
of
are the questions. Michael Tessier, could the 2i stone be the source energy of an old CERN/AID wave, which the elite search to reconnect with? And Kalanu Arte says, do you think the deep state black projects actually have this stone? And this is part of the hidden projects. And
Yes.
do you think it's going to open up demon portals?
Well, you always have to deal with demon portals. No, here's what I think about this. When I was in a series of discussions with Dr. Farrell, I started to refer to things as archaeological wars. That seemed to me what he was describing about, for example, the looting of the Baghdad Museum. And they were looking for some very interesting items left over from the Sumerian culture and the same type of properties that we're talking about. So the 2i story is an archaeological war story. There's no question about it. And whether they have it or not, that's hard to say. They've been looking for it for a long time, and there's been efforts to close other people off from seeing what they're doing. For example, in finding the Hall of Records under the Sphinx, there's been incredible military cover-ups with that. I don't think they've had the ability to apprehend it as of yet. I think that they're hot on the trail of it, but we know that there was a whole CIA file that was released 40 years after the fact, which showed that they had been spying on the Casey's ARE to get information about the Hall of Records. And they sent people in there in 1964. So what is that? That's almost 60 years ago. They sent people in there to work there to try to get information, like behind the scenes information from the Casey Foundation about what Casey had said about the Hall of Records. So like the funding that they did for remote viewing, like the funding they did for the search of Noah's Ark, these things reveal a deep pattern. Those are just surface reflections of the deep process that intelligence agencies are engaged in archaeologically, mystically, in relation to secret societies and mystery schools. Really, intelligence agencies are complete puppets of secret societies. There's no question about it. And I think the top members have to be very deep initiates in those societies. And with that, I think we can wrap up this episode, Ms.
Okay,
Olivia.
I have a bunch of super chatters to thank. Okay, Mark Lane, Shiny Gee, Robert Mathurin, Gillenjoy R, Dumbledore's Army, Stephen, Eurythmia's Fun, Nicholas Sangaris, Kiyoshi's Army, Erica Swenson Elliott, Farmer Funk, Harvardian, Jim Sarge 3ID, Karankawa Kadla Tribe, Jim N, J. Liebgott, Buis Lale, Bobo the Clown, Global Atlantis, Roosevelt Media News, Doreen Hewitt, Denise in Virginia, Soho Trader X, Debbie McAdoo, and Donna G. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. I really appreciate it. Bobo, I thought you had a new name. I'll be looking for it. We really appreciate your support, and it helps us to do, this kind of deep dive reporting that we've been doing. We couldn't do it without your help. And thank you to all our subscribers and to everyone who spreads the word about the work that we're doing here. We'll be back with you on Friday with some very special interviews and it's very exciting stuff there. And then a week from Friday with X Series 129. And get ready because this is going to be hardcore. Yes.
It's part 3, right?
Yeah, that's part of the interviews coming up. That's for Fitz 3 is for, we're going to give that to subscribers, and then a surprise interview for everybody on next Friday. Of course, we're going to have this Friday, and we're also going to have Fitz back in July as well, and some very exciting guests, including, just some really off the charts people. So you're going to want to make sure that you're signed up for the newsletter, free newsletter at darkjournalist.com. Make sure you're on there. Stand up and be counted and get around the censorship as we've been seeing. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'll do a few shout outs. Jack Reacher, Eurythmia is fun. Thank you very much. Oh, right. I can display everybody. Be careful with Ariel's fires. That's interesting. Roosevelt Media News. Thank you, DJ and Olivia, for another great show. It's great to see you out there, Roosevelt. Thanks so much. Najat, it's great to see you. Fantastic. Bo Krills. There can only be one. I agree. Meta Harrington. Wow, Meta, it's great to see you. I'll listen from the beginning. You are stellar researchers. Thank you, Meta. I really appreciate that. C. Joyce. Nicholas Sangaris. It's great to see you. B. Nickel. Philos. Whew. Is that Philos the Tibetan? Brandon Long. Mitch. Wow, just a great crowd out there tonight. Right. Well, you stole my line. It never really ends. We're just really firing up. Absolutely. Lisa Frequency. Catherine Austin Fitz for VP for president. Yeah. Whew. Can you imagine? Boy, what a difference. We love Dark Journalist. Gypsy Moon. I think that it's moving fast for me now, so I almost caught it. Great show. Thank you, DJ. Metamorphosis. Thank you for being out there. Of course, we had Gigi out there earlier. Great to see you. Kate, if you're watching, it's great to see you.
You want a
Horse
crazy
lady?
question at the last minute?
Yes.
Moon Dragon. Question. Could Trump not wanting to reveal the file because Trump's uncle developed Tesla energy weapon, hit Roswell craft, and this was used to help Trump sell the Space Force false flag thing?
Well, I don't know if it's true, but it would explain a lot. It is interesting that when he was having an interview with Don Jr., and Don Jr. said, tell us all about Roswell. And he said, I think some very important things happened. And that whole discussion, and I was like, why is Don Jr. asking him about Roswell? Why not just the UFO file in general? But he went right in for that. That's pretty interesting. DJ rocks. Thank you, Jimmy. I really appreciate that. Netta, Bobo the Clown, Toil Wayne. Wow, I like that. Sometimes I like the one-liners.
Okay.
Oh, here's one.
Give Lavish a shout out.
No, give who?
Lavish.
Lavish? Yes. Lavish. I didn't see it, but it went by. See, it's going so fast. My whole head is spinning. I'm seeing Roswell in front of me. By the way, we have the Roswell anniversary coming up, of course, shortly here. We just did an anniversary show for Kenneth Arnold's incredible sighting in 1947, which set off everything. We just did that one, but there's more anniversary shows coming up that we're doing for you this summer as well.
What is the actual anniversary of Roswell? Is it the third?
Yeah, the crash is the third. That's the interesting thing. And then the report is the 7th. Okay. So the newspaper report comes 4 days later. But, people were seeing it even a couple of days before that. So, but that crash really set off something. And so we know that we're deep into it now. Roswell, Roswells, absolutely. Have you watched the X-Protect documentary? We did a whole thing on Roswells with Bruce Morgan. And Bruce, whose mother was the incredible actress Yvonne DiCarlo. I mean, that makes the documentary. And we're going to be hearing more from Bruce. He's doing some remarkable work himself on that. Stay the course, steady on, says Digas Bearheart.
DJ, have you ever done a Roswell show specifically?
Sure.
I mean, obviously it's come up in a bunch of episodes.
Yeah. But I can see that there's a whole, here's the thing. When you get to Roswell, you get into how they manipulated the original story, because when it came out, it got ahead of everyone. But fundamentally, what I want to say about Roswell is Jesse Marcel was the intelligence officer for the only group that could drop the atomic bomb at that time. So this was the unit. And remember, so everything he found and all the hieroglyphs and all that stuff, that's really the key part of the story. The whole idea about saying that Roswell was a smokescreen and all that doesn't make sense, because they took it out of after the story was released and then said, oh, it's a balloon. And then the story was gone for 30 years. So it's not in there as part of the UFO literature until 1977 and Stanton Friedman, when Jesse Marcel was like, I guess enough time has gone by. I'm going to come out and tell this. So Roswell is a very credible story. And people like Frankie Rowe, whose father saw the beings, dead aliens, basically. It's pretty compelling, So I've always come down on the side that Roswell was a real event. But I've also come down on the side that a lot of the UFO file is X technology that we've utilized. So you've got the problem is you got both working. That's the trick there. Okay, a couple more of these. Can you do more current issues? Well, sure. I mean, Ghislaine Maxwell is about as current as you get. And the thing is, you need a real balance on that. So you have to understand the events that we're in by seeing them through the refraction of what we've got us here. So if you don't understand the Kennedy assassination, for example, you're not going to understand when they go to take down a particular public figure. So it's almost like we need that education to understand where we are. But yeah, there's so much news to cover. I'm right there with you. It's like if I had more hours in the day, we'd be doing it all the time. Great show tonight. Thank you. Lavish. Okay, that's lavish. I get it now. Moments Divine. Olivia Wingsgirl. There you are again. By the way, nice round of applause. Unbelievable. Incredible questions tonight, Olivia. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Off the charts. And thank you for making the time to do this. We will be back with you on Friday with a great new interview. And then a week from Friday with the X series returning. Have a fantastic night out there, and more to come, just completely off the charts, and more to come on the Hot Zone front, including some very, very interesting people who want to talk about it. So thanks so much, and a couple more here at the end. DJ tech in the military is using that looks and sounds like UFOs, etc. Yeah, exactly. We get a lot of that as well, but we have off-world something visiting as well. There's too much of a track record. So you got both operational. Boy, does that get tricky. So thanks so much, everyone. Best wishes, Mitch. Really appreciate it. We will see you all Friday. Miss Olivia, you get the last word.
Darrell Cash says, I'm a rodeo queen. Thank you so much. I love it. I've got the boots for it.
Well, country western all the way. Mm-hmm. We'll see you all Friday.
Okay.
Have a great night, everyone.
God bless.
And it says end broadcast up there, but after all, it never really ends, right? Good night, everyone.